I've been at the OU since 2000 and have been heavily involved in the production of lots of Latin and Greek language modules there, and in especially developing interactive online tools for both of those. More Greek probably, but I'm doing some more Latin at the moment, so it's all going to even out in the end. Mair is doing a PhD in educational research. And she came to the OU a couple of years ago, and we found out that we had lots of common interests, and since then our lives have changed completely. Obviously we started to dress alike, for example, that's the most important one. But we've also been undertaking some various projects together. So this year we are surveying all of the classics departments in the UK about their beginners language teaching, and we're asking them lots of questions about e-learning, what they use and their attitudes towards that. We co-organised a conference which ran in February in the regional centre at the OU in London called eLatin and eGreek. We also did a panel together at the CA's and the Classical Association conference in April on eLearning 2. So we've thrown ourselves in the deep end, got lots of data, and had some very interesting presentations that we've witnessed, but also, as Gavin was saying earlier, actually probably more importantly, lots of interesting conversations with people who are working on similar areas and with similar problems, but who hadn't communicated before. And so all this sounds really exciting and fresh right now. So I'm now going to pass over to Mair to do some of the sciencey bit.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try and wrap some of the more theoretical side of my research around the actual achievements that James has put in place in the Open University. And I'm going to explain that I actually was a classicist for a little bit. I was allowed to sit with the classicists and all that, and I did proper stuff. But this PhD has placed me in education and educational technology in the Open University, where I've been very, very lucky to end up in the modern languages section and to be looking at how we take forward learning of ancient languages, that's Latin and ancient Greek. So I've been put into a strange context, which was initially a little bit uncomfortable, but thank goodness I have fallen in with such good company as James, and my supervisor Eleanor was also from classics in the audience here, so I've kept a foot in both camps, which is sometimes difficult to keep your balance, but I think that in the end it will be for the greater good. Because I'm now able to look over the fence into modern languages, where there has been a vast amount of research into languages, into learning, into technology and its use to support that. And therefore, I have been able to look as if I'm well ahead of the game, because I can look at what all these forward-thinking and well-researched areas are and think, could that benefit us in our ancient language environment? Now, they are different environments with different aims and objectives, but it gives me a wider perspective to look at and to examine whether some of what the wisdom developed in modern languages might just be applicable to the environment that classicists live in. So I'm going to be looking at pedagogy first, at learning theories and theories on the nature of languages, and then leading in towards, this is a good way to go, isn't it, from the pedagogy to the technology, leading in to what technology, the opportunities technology might afford us. Okay, so starting with, this is my framework of language learning, really. So along the top, we've got theories on the nature of language, down the side, theories on the nature of learning. These progress roughly chronologically from left to right and top to bottom, and it's a gross simplification of what's actually happened in the world of modern languages. But it's enabled me to at least situate myself and situate my ideas of ancient language within this framework. So if we very briefly look at the left-hand end of the top axis, we've got the idea of language as something structural, something which codes meaning. So if I can decode the words, I can know the meaning. Whereas at the right-hand end, we've got nature as a kind of socio-cultural tool. It lets me function in a society, it lets me build relationships, it lets me behave appropriately. That language influences how that society works, and that society influences how that language works. A much more mutable thing. As we move down the left-hand end, we go from behaviourist, where I might have a stimulus response mechanism, whereas if I ask you a question and you get it right, I'll pat you on the head. If you get it wrong, I'll give you a clip round the ear. Then we move from that rather basic idea of how learning might take place Two, the idea of socially constructing our knowledge and our meaning in a society again, where once again knowledge is mutable and we will make that knowledge together. And I will learn from people who know more than me, other people who know less might learn from me, but we will evolve that learning in that society as a group. In truth, all these squares are not very likely. What tends to have happened across this century is that in modern languages we've moved along the diagonal from those rather narrow views of language and learning to a much wider society context for language and learning. But it does look good that there seem to be so many opportunities over that fence for me. So let's have a look where I think we're situated in terms of ancient languages. For those of you who do come from classics, you'll be very familiar with these books. These are the books that are mostly used in our universities today, and so in the survey that James and I have been doing of UK university practice, these books have come out well on top. They are hugely amenable to a method called grammar translation, whereby you learn your Amoa Masamat, you take your word, you decode it, and you translate your text painstakingly and thoroughly and very admirably, word by word. Yeah, but it's a method that's very prevalent in our universities, and our UK universities at least today. So, mapping that methodology onto my graph, there you'll see in these two squares here the grammar translation method, largely at the stimulus response end and the structural end of the spectrum, maybe moving a little bit towards some more complex ideas of making conscious efforts, and then moving out towards that society environment. But really, we're staying very much in that top left-hand column. There are, in one or two universities, and actually possible with the use of those books, just about, moves towards a graded reading, and I think we'll see some of this when James comes on, towards graded reading, where we move through passages, so that as we move through more and more difficult passages, we can, rather than sitting and learning a Amoa Masamat, maybe absorb how the endings of Latin words are used. And so that we're seeing a more constructivist approach, where we build on what we already know and add to our knowledge little by little as we progress through these texts, and a more functional approach to language, where language is actually something that lets you achieve things, lets you get things done in a particular language. So that's how I see our situation in terms of the pedagogy. Now, I've also recently, and this is very recently, in fact in the last few hours, been working on a framework for technology. And the first three bits of this are pinched from somebody called Fisher and his conceptual overview of how technology and language learning has progressed in roughly decades there. So that at the top, my arithmetic's going to let me down, it's probably roughly the 80s, where we start with language learning, and we're doing some very simple things like drill and testing on standalone machines, and we're doing some things like maybe recordings and language labs. And then we're moving forward, because there was a time before there was the web, you know, I don't know if you remember that, but before there was a time, and then moving forward as the web becomes more and more ubiquitous on into serving information on that web so that people can come and read it, to being able for them to communicate and interact on that, and then to be able to form actual societies, to form cultures that actually live online and communicate and evolve and grow online together. So you can see that marvellously, I put this one in myself, by the way, that's original Lloyd if you want to cite it. You can see that this miraculously progresses in the same kind of direction as the two pedagogy strands that I've shown you do too, so that we end up moving along those three axes together. Okay, now I've placed here, along with the grammar translation and graded reading axis. I haven't managed to work out how to draw properly in 3 dimensions yet, but I'm working on it. If anybody's got any help with that, I'd be most grateful. I've just put these against the grammar translation and grading. These are some of the things that you will find in ancient language learning today. Mostly we are still using drill testing, flashcards, etc. We're still using online dictionaries, we're still using text hyperlink, and those are all very admirable. And what I've forgotten to say is that these do not necessarily wipe out the previous ones, that all of those continue to coexist through time. But I think that as yet we haven't tapped into, and that's why I was so impressed with your presentation a little bit earlier, we haven't really tapped into communicating with each other in those languages that we're trying to learn. We've done the meta communication, we communicate about those languages, but we haven't really used it, at least in UK universities very much, to communicate in the language concerned, or to build up social communities around our ancient languages, which is a possibility if we think it's going to lead to achieving what we actually want to achieve through learning ancient languages. But before I come on to deciding, or to looking at how we decide which of these boxes we would like to position ourselves in, I'd like us to have a look at what has been achieved and what benefits have been delivered. So I'm passing over to my mate here, who's going to tell you that.
Okay, so this comes from a 2009 HEFGE document about the possible benefits of new technology in, for teaching and learning. And so these are the three categories that they came up with in those heady days. So efficiency, enhancement, and transformation. So I'm just going to talk about a few examples of projects that I know, of tools which are used to teach Latin and Greek, which could arguably fall under these three categories. I was going to start by showing off some of the stuff that we do at the OU under the title of efficiency. We developed this Introducing Ancient Greek site, and we revised it a few years ago. It was originally developed about 10 years ago, I would say, where students get the opportunity to learn the alphabet before they start studying the course formally, for example. And of course this is very efficient because students can use as long as they need to get on top of that skill, and then you come to the first tutorial and people are roughly at the same level, rather than having that very painful process when some people are up to speed and others aren't, right at the beginning when some students are raring to go. So I just got a few slides there. You learn the alphabet, the alphabetical order. In the revisions that we did, you can now click on the words and hear me pronouncing them, and you get some basic vocabulary in there at the same time. We do a bit on basic sentence structure as well. These are all open access, so this also helps students get an idea whether learning Greek is for them, which again is efficient, because if it's not, then they can choose to do something else instead. These are other tools that we developed with the OU. So these are sort of drop and drag exercises which are connected with their texts, for example. And so perhaps these come in under the next category, which is enhancement. The example I was actually going to use of enhancement was Alison Sharrock and the project that she's developed at Manchester. They use Reading Latin there, one of the textbooks which Mair showed to you before. They had a problem which Alison identified a few years ago, which was what she describes as an appalling failure rate. So 30% of the students that were taking the beginner's Latin module were getting uncompensatable fails at the end, and then either having to retake that, and if they didn't succeed retaking that, then take another course to make up for it the next year. This was letting students down. She has spent an extraordinary amount of time putting a lot of early help connected very closely to the textbook online. So what's the Latin word for this? What does this Latin word mean? Type in the answer, multiple choice, grammar questions, all the rest of it. And she's turned that failure rate from 30% round, so now there are no students who get uncompensatable fails on that module. So that's efficiency in itself, but also very much enhanced what students do. She also uses learning analytics, so she can look at which students are engaging. There's a strong correlation from the data that she's got that the more students engage, the more they succeed. And so if students aren't engaging, she can get onto them and say, why don't you start engaging? So I don't have examples of what Alison's doing, partly because of the whole paywall problem, but I do have an example of something that we do which is not so dissimilar, where you drag and drop exercises. Again, these are connected to Reading Greek this time, which we use. More stuff which I think comes under enhancement that we've done, a multiple choice tester. This is jointly set up with Eton, who had money to do a project, and we said, can we piggyback on that, and we did. So this kind of format will be familiar to anyone who's used the Cambridge Latin course as well. It's basically the same program. And then this is another thing that we developed as well, which I guess I can put under enhancement, which allows students to test themselves on cases and what have you, and you can make it more complicated if you want by going into help and changing the settings. In terms of transformation as well, I suppose arguably we have transformed the way that students are learning as well, but actually what we do has been done much more formally by others in the flipped classroom environment. I'm sure this is a phrase familiar to many of you. There's, at our conference in February, Bart Natalie, who's now at Virginia, is it?
Yes, just
yeah, gave a talk on his flipped classroom Latin model, for example. And what you do there is students access materials online, often PDFs, but still online, do the work which you normally do inside the classroom, outside the classroom, and then when you have your session, you discuss problems. And so what you do in the classroom is completely different from the traditional language model of all turning up. This is how it normally works with your exercises that you've done and your translation that you've prepared and just kind of slogging through it. Now, you actually address problems and you reconceptualize what goes on inside a classroom. Nick Lowe has done something not so dissimilar, I suppose, in many respects at Royal Holloway, where he has put all of their Latin textbook online. So students do all of their exercises online, type in their answers. He's had to spend hours and years and whatever writing all of this, but then again he lurks, sees what problems students are having, and then addresses those problems in the classroom. So transformative. I just wanted to show this as well because Mair was talking about morphological tools. This is an Explorer tool, which again anyone who's familiar with the Cambridge Latin course will be familiar with this, but we've now using this technology in our new Latin module. So this is basically you click on a word and it tells you what that word means, and it tells you grammatical information about it as well. So there are lots of wonderful things that you can do with modern technology, which fit very neatly into those categories: and efficiency, enhancement, and transformation. And there are very real advances going on there. But it's not all great news, and I suppose that's some of the interesting things which have come out of the discussions that we've had. There is a question as to where the pedagogy is in all of this. Bart gave a very neat example in his talk that he gave at Nottingham, again about the flipped classroom, about when actually things went wrong and he had to sort of rebuild it all from scratch to get his students back on side. He was also talking about the fact that innovation is often seen as just good in and of itself, and actually there are some things we do very well that we now stop doing because technology allows us to do it slightly differently, but we're spending money and time developing that, but are we really improving the student experience and student learning, or at least are we always improving it? So I put some other points here. So yeah, students expect, especially if you've been through schools nowadays, you're expecting things to be interactive. It's true, but that can run into the problem of style over substance. There's this issue of how we use the kit. Steve Green from Cambridge was giving a really interesting talk in February about this Explorer thing where you can click on all of the words. And he observed classrooms being taught by very enthusiastic teachers who are jumping around and clicking on the words for the students, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the students are learning any more or better. Actually, bizarrely, it can make them into very passive learners. And yeah, so traditional innovation, again, there are good things that we have been doing, so let's keep trying to do those as well as innovating as well. Okay, and other headaches too. Again, this emerged well from the talks. By technical issues, I don't just mean when you want to bash your computer up, but also the fact that platforms are changing all the time. I spend a lot of time in my job talking about how to make stuff that we developed in the past compatible with a new wave of devices, for example. That's time that I spend as a language teacher talking through technical issues that I don't understand, and I don't know that that's always time well spent. There are other time and money issues. These are incredibly expensive for us to produce at the OU, and when I start asking questions outside the OU, these are people often doing work on a shoestring or getting their husbands involved, in the case of Alison Sharrock, and just putting tens and hundreds of hours into developing this stuff for free. That's an issue. Fixed resources. Oh yeah, I think that was I think this was about the fact that the stuff that we develop, especially for beginners, has to be very closely related to textbooks, for example. And when things change, then all of the technology that we've developed going around all that, all the kit that we developed, can become obsolete. And then the barriers to sharing issue as well. Alison's done this great stuff at Manchester, Nick's done this great stuff at Royal Holloway. I can't see any of it because it's all part of their internal student site and it's all password protected. At least at the OU, the stuff that we develop nearly always goes online as an open educational resource.
So, you've seen quite a lot of stories of achievement already within the framework that's currently owned by Ancient Languages. I'd like to extend that, but how do we make good choices in either of those areas? How do we ensure that we're investing our effort and our time and our money in the right areas that are going to actually benefit us? How do we decide whether those things in the sweetie jar of technology and different pedagogies are going to actually make us better? So, very simplistically here, I'm describing the model that I'm using for my research at the moment, and it's a very common model for using research, where we will look at the theories of learning languages. This is a very idealistic picture. Look at the theories of learning languages. From that, design our pedagogy and technology to support those methods that are underpinned by a strong and sound grounding in theory. And we will then move on and implement them in courses and modules, or even standalone, there is room for that too, evaluate them and feed back into the theory. And that evaluation will have to be in terms of, are they good for the students, what do the tutors think, and does it affect how well they actually do at learning that language, or at learning what it is we define that we want them to learn in that language. In the real world, this cycle probably hardly ever happens, and you need to be able to join it and pick up at any particular point, so that, for example, where we already have stuff that's been implemented, let's test how well it works, let's see how well things do work relative to each other, and let's then feed that back into our theories and feed that back into how we spend our money in the future, our time. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. I'm going to very briefly show you one of the, well, I'm just going to show you a screenshot actually, one of the websites where I've been evaluating the use of resources, where students who are currently at the OU get to try out a variety of different online resources and to vote them up and down. On each page there's a thumbs up, thumbs down thing, and to actually comment about whether they like them or not. It's a start, and it's one of the many angles that I'm looking at the use of technology from. If you'd like to talk to me about that later, then I will go on about it endlessly, given an opportunity, but I think we're coming towards the end of our allocated time. So I'm going to move on to what next. And this isn't just a selfish plea, honest, but I do think that we need to have people who, like me, are enormously fortunate, and know they're enormously fortunate, to actually have the time to do research into the pedagogy and into the technology. Because those of us on the chalk face and those of us out in the real world, that time is very, very hard to find. But that those of us who are that privileged engage with and contribute to those language learning theories, and also take inspiration, as we are doing today, from many other disciplines and be ready to adapt and learn from others. So that's what's next from me. Now it's what's next from him.
And so yeah, what this year has taught me, having a conference in February, doing the e-learning panel at the CA, and also today, that sharing our successes is really important, finding out what other people are doing, but also sharing failures. And it's really good to have people being honest enough to admit when things go wrong and how and if they've been able to fix those. Talking about increasing the confidence of instructors and students as well, I think it can be a bit too straightforward when you're an enthusiast somehow to think that everyone else is going to be an enthusiast too. Sometimes students are way ahead of me, especially me, in terms of technology, but sometimes students are way behind me as well. And so having the kind of old-fashioned ways of doing things there as one of the range of options that you give to students, I think is important. And that's also the case with instructors. Again, at the OU we have a phalanx of associate lecturers who mediate our courses for us, who teach the students on a more personal level than I do, who write teaching materials that go out to everybody. But taking all of those instructors with you, making them comfortable with the technology and explaining the pedagogy for them is important too. And the last one, yes, is just to keep up the conversation about pedagogy as we are doing today. Thank you.